So yeah, I think it's crucial for Christians to recognize the distinction between certain moral and biblical principles and the policies which are tactical/strategic ways of attempting to implement those moral principles, and leaving space for one another, even when we agree on the principles, the moral or biblical principles, to disagree and offer Christian freedom, charity of judgment on those points of strategic, tactical, prudential disagreement.
Welcome to the Crossway Podcast, a show where we sit down with authors each week for thoughtful interviews about the Bible, theology, church history, and the Christian life. I'm Matt Tully, and today I'm talking with Jonathan Leeman. Jonathan serves as the editorial director for 9 Marks and as an elder at Cheverly Baptist Church just outside of Washington, D.C. He and Andy Naselli are the co-authors of a new book from Crossway, How Can I Love Church Members with Different Politics? Today, Jonathan and I discuss how Christians should think about political disagreements within the church. He makes the important distinction between clear biblical principles on the one hand and prudential applications of those principles on the other, shares his take on how much pastors and church leaders should say regarding their own political perspectives, online and in person, and offers advice for those worried about political controversy causing division within their church. Let's get started. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me today on the Crossway Podcast.
Matt, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
So it seems like the political landscape, at least in the U.S., but I think even around the world in different parts, is more polarized, more frustrated, more distrustful than ever before. And you studied political science at both an undergraduate and graduate level. And so I wonder, do you actually think that's the case, or is this something that every generation feels?
Yes and yes. I do think it's the case, at least as indicated by polls, that you'll see levels of civil trust, for instance, and trust in the institutions of society are down considerably, even from the 1960s. You see greater degrees of partisanship in various legislative matters or lawmaking in general. Just think about the fact that in 1986, Antonin Scalia was confirmed in the Senate by a vote of 98 to 0-2, I think it was. It was definitely 98 yes. But now think about our Supreme Court nominations now. They're purely bipartisan affairs. Number of reasons we could look to for why that's the case. All sorts of things from, on the one hand, in 1995, when Newt Gingrich came in as Speaker of the House, he no longer required Congress people to stay, or the people in the Republican Party to stay in Washington, D.C. over the weekends. And previously, congressmen, for instance, had stayed in D.C. over the weekends. And that meant people would intermingle with other congressmen and senators even across the aisle. But now they're going home and they're not doing that intermingling. They're not part of the same school. They're not at the pool with their kids together, right? So you have less. We could talk about that. We could talk about social media, right? And how social media has an effect on the division in the culture. We feel, I'd say that's probably even a bigger role than anything Newt Gingrich did or didn't do. Lots of things we could point to, but yes, bottom line, I think there's more rancor, more distrust, more division as part of our present times.
So are you saying that there was a time when politicians were required to stay in D.C. for some amount of the year, or was that like a rule?
It was, I don't know if it was a rule or not, honestly. It was a fairly common practice for congressmen or a senator just to stay through the weekend. They built their lives in Washington, D.C. They would visit home to their districts less often, less frequently. That changed with a number of certain rules. I can't give you the specifics on it. Back in, as I said, in the mid-90s. So if you went to a Georgetown dinner party in the 1980s, you would find Democrat and Republican senators clinking glasses together and building relationships, even though they disagreed on Monday morning when they got to work, right? No longer is that the case. No longer do you find members of the two parties on the whole fraternizing with one another and building relationships and going to Little League games.
Well, and that seems so relevant even to the second comment you made about social media, where we just see this fracturing of interaction where we kind of get into our own tribes and groups and we talk in those. but it seems like true relationship across the aisle is becoming less and less of a real thing.
No, I think that's exactly right. And social media as a platform, as a medium, is not set up for A, building real relationships, B, garnering trust across lines of dispute, C, persuasion. Well, think about a tweet. It's 280 characters. What can I do? I can't give you nuance. I can't give you tone of voice. I can't give you body language. I can't give you a history of conversation. All I can do is blast you. I think this, right? So people go on there with good intentions, right? With consciences telling them, I need to stand up for the truth. But what happens is they stand up for the truth in 280 characters. They don't persuade anybody. All they do is they kind of reify the lines that are already there. They gather around them people who already agree with them, but they don't do anything to build bridge to the other side. In other words, the medium of, say, Twitter, and I think the same is true of Facebook and whatever else you might want to say, is just not set up for A, building trust, which is B, necessary for persuasion. So what we get is just a lot of shouting at each other.
Yeah, there are so many cultural and social issues these days that have this strong political side of them. They have strong political dimensions. And it seems like even among Christians, maybe especially among Christians who all love the gospel, who all love the Bible, there can be this theoretical agreement on some of the underlying principles, some of the core principles, not just of our faith, but even principles related to our society. But then there's disagreement on how policy decisions should be made based on those principles, and that's where we disagree. And it seems to me sometimes, because of that disagreement on policy, we can lose a recognition of the more foundational agreement that we have on the principles that we all hold to as Christians. Have you observed that dynamic? And if so, how important is that to recognize?
Yeah, that's a great point, Matt. And I think it goes to the heart of the challenge of politics in the local church. You and I both agree that, say, racism is wrong. You might then say, well, therefore we need racial reparations. And I might say, no, that's a horrible idea. And then you might be tempted to say, but look, Jonathan, if you're not willing to support matters of restitution, like Zacchaeus did, I'm not sure you really understand what repentance is. And I say, oh no, Matt, that's so wrong. If you don't understand that once somebody is forgiven, that sin can't travel down to the next generation and indict me, and I pay for the sins of I'm not called to pay for the sins of my father. You don't understand the gospel. What's going on? Well, step one, you and I agree that racism is wrong. Step two, we might even agree that, say, American slavery was wrong. Step three, we disagree, however, on a specific policy matter, restitutions for American slavery, as the right response to that basic point of agreement between us. And then, point four, you and I effectively start excommunicating each other, saying, I don't think you understand the gospel. And what happens? Well, the temperatures go up. We get angry at each other. We have a hard time sitting down at the Lord's table together, right? So yeah, I think it's crucial for Christians to recognize the distinction between certain moral and biblical principles and the policies which are tactical/strategic ways of attempting to implement those moral principles, and leaving space for one another to, even when we agree on the principles, the moral or biblical principles, to disagree and offer Christian freedom, charity of judgment on those points of strategic, tactical, prudential, we put it that way, prudential disagreement. And most policy is prudential. Not all, but most.
So, and that's where you're not necessarily saying that in kind of making that case for leaving a little space, as you've said, that's not the same thing as saying that no one's right and no one's wrong, potentially in a specific policy judgment that they might make. Is that right?
That's exactly right. 1 Kings chapter 3, two prostitutes come in front of Solomon. One says, my baby. The other says, no, it's my baby. Well, there's a right answer to that question. Solomon doesn't know it, but there is a right answer. What does he need? He needs wisdom. And wonderfully, Right before that passage, we're told that God had offered him anything and that God had given him, he asked for wisdom and God had given it. So then Solomon says, I don't know, maybe he talks to his advisors. His advisors are like, oh, do this. The others are like, oh, no, that. Solomon scratches his head and finally says, I know, bring me a sword, cut the baby in half. And of course, and the real mother says, no, she can have it. And then the narrator sums up this whole real life practical episode in which the answers aren't in the Bible, this real life practical episode by saying, and the people of God were amazed that God had given wisdom to Solomon to do justice. Okay, what was the goal? The goal is justice. That should always be the goal of politics. We're trying to do what is just. But what do we need to figure out what is just? Well, we need wisdom, right? And so much of politics is just asking the Lord, oh, Lord, please give me wisdom so that I might do justice. That's not to say there's not a right answer. There often, not always, often is. But none of us have the apostolic ability to know the revelation of God to say right now, I used reparations as an example. Let me use another one. We should not adopt this measure or go to this march on abortion. So look, you and I can even agree on abortion that it's wrong, but different people are going to come along and recommend different ways of going about tackling it. What do we need to know what's the best way? Well, we need, as Solomon did, wisdom. And that's where Christians have a lot of fights with each other. And it's okay to disagree. It's okay to say, look, I really think the path that you're recommending on this racial problem, on this abortion problem, on this whatever, I really think it's unwise. But again, unless you're an apostle, unless the Lord has revealed to you as Holy Writ the way to approach it, you better be slow to condemn your fellow believers when they make different kinds of prudential judgments.
So as you look out over the church in America, maybe let's say the evangelical church in America, and I'm asking you to generalize, and maybe that's not a fair thing to do, but
yeah, this will be easy.
Do you think that the church would do well to have more emphasis on the unity of principles that we share as Christians, or do you think we do need to continue to show in more relief the areas in which we disagree?
That is a tough question. I mean, it really just depends on the time and place and the people. I mean, there are, and sometimes with Christians in America, I kind of want to just say, shut up. We don't all need to know your opinion on this or that candidate. We don't all need to know your view on this policy matter. Nobody made you a subject matter expert on it. Please just stop talking. You're dragging the gospel into your view on this. And hey, look, notice how, the reputations of evangelicals are going at this particular moment. So just please be quiet. Let's emphasize what the Bible emphasizes and stop. Okay, times I want to say that. But of course, what do you know what Ecclesiastes 3 says? There's a time and a place for everything. So sometimes I want to say, shut up. Other times I want to say, hey, friends, we need to speak up. We need to address these matters and we need to get active. We need to protest. We need to start looking for political solutions. Now be careful before you attach the name of Christ and the church to those political solutions. I'm not saying you should do that. I'm not saying you make it a matter of excommunication or this what the preacher preaches about on Sunday, but Christians need to get involved and speak up. So, what do we need more of, Matt? I'm reluctant to say. I'm maybe slightly inclined to say, given our utopian pretensions, given how easily we as Christians in the early 21st century tend to think our solutions are going to be found in politics. That means we're going to probably inclined to speaking more than we should. So I'm probably inclined to say, hey folks, let's just keep our mouths shut. At least when speaking on behalf of the church. But again, I just can't make that blanket statement for every occasion.
So you mentioned just a minute ago how most of the tricky political issues that we're facing right now are related in some way or another to the idea of justice, our pursuit of a just society and a just government that treats people the right way, however we might define that. So how do you think about the intersection of a passion for justice, that is what motivates so much of our political engagement and discourse, with the need for humility in those kinds of discussions as we recognize our own limits and biases? I guess another way to put it is, what does it look like to be humble in the midst of political disagreement and yet not be a pushover when it comes to, our convictions about what's important and true?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. And you're right to say, so let me just start by kind of repeating what you said. At the heart of politics is the pursuit of justice. That's what we're called to do. We're called to make righteous judgments. That's one way to define justice. Righteous judgments. So you have a standard, righteousness, and then you make an assessment, a judgment based on that standard. You say guilty, not guilty, right? So justice is righteous judgments. And the goal of politics, as I said, is to pursue justice. Proverbs 29, verse 4, by justice the king builds up the land. 1 Kings 3:28, and the people were amazed that God had given wisdom to Solomon to do justice, right? The Queen of Sheba commends Solomon in chapter 10 of 1 Kings about brings justice. And I think the foundation of government's authority begins right there in Genesis 9. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for man was made in the good image of God. You can call that a justice mechanism, right? Insofar as a person has been violated, there's to be a reciprocity, a retribution, an establishing of justice. So yeah, that is what we're after. And that's why people get so animated when it comes to politics, and why you should get animated. What should make you angry? Well, injustice should make you angry. A child being abused should make you angry. A people being exploited or oppressed should make you angry. Anger is a God-given emotion in response to injustice. The challenge, of course, is that none of us have perfectly calibrated scales for adjudicating justice, for rendering righteousness, right? None of us get it right every time. So as you say, Matt, there is a need for some epistemic humility in my rendering of judgments. So yes, on the one hand, we are all called to seek justice, pursue justice. We're all called to render righteous judgments. On the other hand, as I said before, none of us are apostles with the Spirit of God revealing Scripture to us. We're going to get it wrong. We're going to get it wrong because we're finite. We're going to get it wrong because we're fallen. So there's just this really tricky balance that we need to strike between my pursuit of rendering righteous judgments and my need to recognize that I could get it wrong, and other people are going to stand and right judgment over me in some of my blind spots and some of my sins and so forth. One way as Christians, I think we deal with this dilemma is we establish two categories. We call them whole church matters, doctrine of faith matters, and Christian freedom matters. Christians unite around whole church matters. Doctrine of faith matters. Who is Jesus? Who is God? Who is man? What's the Bible? What's it take to be saved? And so forth. Okay, those things we all agree on to be members of the same church, right? Everything else falls into this other bucket, the Christian freedom bucket. So depending on which of these two buckets I'm operating out of, I'm going to increase or decrease my zeal, my level of certainty. So if we're talking about whether or not Jesus got up from the dead, yes, preach that from the pulpit, bind the conscience, make it a matter of church discipline, absolutely hold fast and hard to it. If we're talking about universal health care, well, that's over here in the Christian freedom bucket. And I'm happy for Christians to I'm willing for Christians to disagree on that sort of mean. And so in that case, yeah, exercise a little bit more humility, lower the volume, lower the temperature, have good, solid debates about why you think universal healthcare is a good or bad idea, but recognize that you're here in Christian freedom land. You're not over there in whole church statement of faith land. And that should affect how we interact, especially with other believers.
But what would you say to the person who maybe rejects that distinction, or at least says it's more complicated than that? There are all kinds of political issues where this person would argue that there's a clear biblical principle at play, and then there is a clear outworking that should flow from that. And so if someone is opposed to that outworking, that political response, they are essentially tantamount to saying, I don't care about this political issue. And they might say, you can say you care about it, but if you're unwilling to do X, that demonstrates to me that you actually don't believe that principle as you say you do. So I guess what would your response be where they might say the lines are more blurry than that, or maybe they want to draw the lines in different places than you would?
Yeah, utterly affirm the fact that people might disagree about where we should draw the line, but that we should draw a line, I'm going to insist on. In other words, you do not want to make every single political issue a whole church issue. Nor do you want to say there are no whole church issues. Everybody's going to have that line somewhere. I'm just trying to help you recognize that it's there. And now we can get to the conversation about what goes on which side of the line. But let's just start by saying there is a line there. Some issues are whole church issues. Some church are Christian freedom issues. Robert Benet, a Lutheran political scientist, talks about straight line, jagged line issues. Straight line issues lead to, I would call, whole church judgments. Jagged line issues lead to, call it the Christian freedom. Straight line issues are those issues where there's a straight line between the biblical text and a policy application. Biblical text, you shall not murder. Biblical text, surely you knew me when I was in my mother's womb. Policy application, abortion's wrong. Pretty straight line from one to the other, right? Don't got to do a lot of logical deductive thinking to get from the text to that policy application. Jagged line issue, yeah, I might bring certain biblical principles to bear on my views on healthcare. But it's a lot harder to get from biblical texts about caring for the poor, caring for the hurting and the needy, private property, you shall not steal, down to questions about whether or not the government is responsible for healthcare and how much the government should put in. It's a jagged line, right? You have multiple arguments need to feed into that. Okay, so over here in straight line, whole church issues, yeah, we should take a biblical stand. And taking a biblical stand in that regard means the preacher should preach it, and you should practice church membership decisions over it. So you might disagree with me about whether or not marches are helpful in response to abortion. You might disagree with me about whether or not we should fight for various partial measures, but one thing is certain, you cannot support abortion. And so if you are an abortion advocate, an abortion promoter, you can't be a member of my church. We will actually, if you are seeking to promote and support and practice abortion, we will actually remove you from membership in my church. If you are a member of the Ku Klux Klan, we will remove you from membership in the church. I am calling those things straight line issues, whole church judgments. Okay. But again, over here in jagged line, Christian freedom, there's just going to be a whole host of things that you might bring big biblical principles to bear. I'm not saying this is the domain of moral equivalency. I'm not saying that at all. Make moral arguments. But recognize that when you notch it up a level to that whole church thing, you are now speaking for Bible. You are now speaking as an apostle. And I'm not sure you want to do that with most biblical issues. Most political issues. Again, as a matter of humility. So we can argue about which goes where, but that you need the distinction, I think, is crucial and a huge aid to charity, patience, unity in the church.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you think about all this as a pastor? Because I think that's where sort of pastors need to make specific decisions and need to say, am I going to mention something about this issue or not? And if I do, what am I going to say about it? Maybe speak first to the pastor when it comes to preaching. Say a pastor is working through a passage expositionally and come upon a principle that to him feels like a very applicable, relevant principle for some political issue. How does he know when it's appropriate or not appropriate to mention those political things, to highlight the fact that these principles might have bearing on some political controversy of the day?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. And the very one I think a lot of pastors are struggling with. Number one, what is your job as a pastor? Well, it's to preach the Bible. It's to bind consciences with the Bible. It's to point to the way of life and obedience and away from the path of death and disobedience. That is your job. And therefore, when you stand up behind the pulpit, you are seeking to do that. Say, friends, people of God, this is the way we walk, to walk in righteousness and obedience according to God's own word. I don't care about your opinions on dental practices. I don't care about your engineering speculations. I don't care about your political opinions insofar as those are not drawn out of the word of God. Now, I might privately be curious to know what you think, but it has no bearing on me as a Christian seeking to follow Jesus as you follow Jesus, right? So to answer your question, Matt, number one, pastor, please restrain your tongue to speak only Bible or things that are clear from the Bible, as the Westminster Confession puts it, by good and necessary consequence. As soon as you start stepping out kind of layers of implication away from Scripture, layers of logical deduction, that's when you increasingly become like a Pharisee. Well, now we're commanded to tithe. Does that mean we need to tithe our mint and our cumin and our dill? That's where you're tying people up with burdens that are too much for them to bear. That's the pathway of in kind of historically of Christian fundamentalism, where we start extrapolating outward from the Bible to all sorts of ways where we're going to say, well, I think the Bible means you can't dance, drink, or chew, or go with girls who do, right? That's where, Christians shouldn't chew gum and go to the movie theater sort of thing. They had good arguments, rational, deduced from scriptural arguments for why Christians should never go to movie theaters or to dance or listen to music with a beat. But just ask yourself, are we going too far? Are you sure you really want to bind the conscience there? And in the same way, to the pastor, I want to say, be careful that you are speaking Bible or something that's good and clear, good necessary consequence from the Bible. If not, I might have a personal conversation with you privately, Matt, and say, gosh, it really doesn't seem right to me that they do this on immigration. But even then, I just want to be super careful insofar as I bear the title of pastor, not to wrongly bind the conscience where God has not allowed me to bind it. Can I give you a quick story?
Yeah.
This kind of illustrates this. This is out of my book, How the Nations Rage, from a couple of years ago. My pastor, Mark Dever, when he first moved to Washington, D.C. and started pastoring Capitol in 1994, had a U.S. senator as a member of the church named Mark Hatfield, senator from Oregon. He was in his last years. And in that same year, as I've already mentioned him twice, Newt Gingrich has got a couple of mentions in this conversation.
Newt, if you're listening, you'll appreciate that.
Yeah. So he won, or there was a large majority of Republicans who won in 94, the House and the Senate. So they had both chambers in response to, of course, Clinton taking the presidency in 92. And so Newt came in with his contract for America. Right. And one of the stipulations was a balanced budget amendment. And 66 senators in the U.S. Senate had passed or had voted for the balanced budget amendment. One U.S. senator had held out, Mark Hatfield, member of Capitol Hill Baptist Church. So he invited Mark down to his office one day and said, Mark, the press is hounding me. The party whip is hounding me. All my fellow senators are hounding me. And by the way, I think it had already passed the House and it's in the Senate now. And he was a 2/3 vote. Everybody's hounding me. You're my pastor. What should I do? Okay, so Mark Dever, young, brand new pastor, age 33, 34 on Capitol Hill. As he's recounting this to me, he said, now, Jonathan, I had an opinion on what he should do. In fact, I had a very strong opinion on what he should do. I cared about this particular issue. And so I said to him, Senator Hatfield, I'll pray for you. And that's all he would give him. I said, Mark, well, why did you tell him more? He said, because, Jonathan, I'm a pastor. I know I'm right about the resurrection. I know I'm right about the gospel. So I'm not sure I'm right about a U.S. balanced budget amendment. And therefore, I'm going to reserve my pastoral capital in Hatfield's life for those issues where I know the Bible has told me to speak. If we'd been talking about the 13th Amendment or 14th Amendment or 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which pertained to slavery and equal citizenship and voting rights, well, then I would have spoken, because there I think a clear biblical principle is at play. So I'm not saying I would never speak. I'm just saying, as a pastor, I got to be very careful to speak Bible and only Bible.
So that's interesting, because you're kind of broadening then. I think oftentimes there's kind of broad agreement that pastors, church leaders should be reticent to involve politics in too direct a way in their preaching. But I think it maybe is different when it comes to their social media activity or their conversations, personal, private conversations with their church members or others. So are you essentially saying that you would be very cautious about even those interactions as a pastor?
Yes, absolutely I would. Now, I don't think you have to exercise quite the same caution as you do in the pulpit, but certainly you do. I taught a class called Christians in Government when I was a member and elder at Capitol Baptist. And I remember after teaching one particular class, a young lady came up to me afterwards and she said, "Okay, Jonathan, we have 3 potential candidates for mayor in the DC elections. All of them, Republican, Democrat, Independent, all of them are pro-choice. So I don't have a pro-choice or pro-life option. What should I do?" Well, in response, I didn't give her what I would do, but I offered her some biblical principles that I thought she could bring. And don't ask me what they're, because I don't remember. But I remember I offered a few biblical principles that I hoped would help her judgment. But I didn't feel like, given the thing that she gave me, I didn't feel able to kind of wade in and offer my counsel there. So yeah, also on Twitter, goodness, or Facebook. Yes, Pastor, please, you're standing up and you're speaking in front of potentially the entire planet. Be very careful about what you say and don't say.
So what counsel would you give to the pastor then who maybe is seeing what other people, their congregants are writing on social media? That seems to be we're not certainly right now, we're not all getting together and talking politics in person, but social media is this interesting place where it's all in public for the world to see, and we have these conversations. I'm thinking the pastor who maybe has seen people in his church, members in his church, posting things that he finds maybe deeply troubling, maybe inconsistent with some of the principles in Scripture that he and the elders of a church would hold to. But he's seeing this stuff not from a personal conversation. He's seeing it on social media, and he just feels a little bit unsure as what to do. What would you counsel him to do?
Well, you can do 2 things. You can forbear and love and pray, or you can talk to the person. Those are your 2 options, right? Okay, when do I decide I'm not just going to forbear and love? I'm going to speak, because there is a time to forbear and love. I might recognize that certain things that Joe is saying on Facebook might challenge other members, annoy other members, frustrate other members. But you know what? There's a time and a place for me to ask them to step up and forbear and be patient with Joe, even as he expresses his opinions. So just because Joe is saying something that might cause a little bit of frustration to me or to others isn't necessarily a reason to get into Joe's business and say, take it down or whatever. No, we need to treat people like adults and give them opportunities to in some ways work things out themselves. At the same time, yeah, I still have to have a category of being willing to address Joe for his social media posts. And obviously, one of the first things I'm going to do is, one of the first reasons I'm going to address him is if I think it's going to prove disruptive to the unity of the body in some form or fashion, that I worry that people might be tempted to fall out of fellowship, might find it difficult to come to the Lord's table together. I mean, it's hard to say when you've crossed that line.
Yeah. Well, and that just seems very relevant right now in particular. I've heard numerous stories from churches where there are true seeds of division, either beginning to grow, if not having fully manifested themselves on these different political fault lines. And, a lot of times the response of pastors is to try to say, yeah, let's be careful about that division. We don't want to sow those seeds as members. But then others can hear that and feel like that's a suppression of my personal beliefs that we all agree aren't core orthodox issues. So how does a pastor balance that desire for unity in the church with respecting people's individual beliefs and that being okay?
Well, that's precisely why I said I need to allow some of that stuff to go on and not get into Joe's business and say something, and to treat people like adults, right? Yeah. So I think another reason I might confront Joe is if he's clearly sinning in some way. Certainly if he's supporting sin, like if he's calling for abortion or whatever, support or something, yeah, I might confront him then. Probably will confront him then. If he's being just a jerk, a real jerk, and I have any kind of relationship with Joe, I might look for ways to bring it up with him. I've done that before. I've contacted members and said, hey, listen, I'm not sure that was the best way to say things. And wonderfully, members have responded humbly and removed things. And even one case, I remember a guy apologizing on social media. Yeah, but the question of unity, if a matter is in an area of jagged line Christian freedom, Yeah, I don't know that I am going to necessarily ask Joe to remove it, precisely because it's in the domain of Christian freedom. No, it's going to be more the way he goes about comporting himself, probably, that will be disruptive of unity, that I think that I'm concerned with. Again, if he's a jerk, he attacking people. Now, again, if it's a whole church matter, well, then we're talking about sin, and so I address him on those grounds. So I've kind of worked myself towards a better answer. Maybe I should have started with Matt. Okay, 2 reasons. Number one, if it's a whole church matter and it's a matter of sin, then I need to address Joe. If we're in a Christian freedom bucket, I'm less likely to address him for the thing itself, and more likely only address him for the way he goes about talking about it. Is it loving? Is it peace producing, or is it cantankerous and rancorous and unkind?
Yeah, that's a helpful distinction. Another issue that I think many of us are wrestling with right now is whether or not, or to what extent, that we're morally implicated in the failings, in the sins, maybe of a certain party or an individual figure, or even the system as a whole, just by virtue of participating in the political process. We hear that a lot. This issue comes up when you get to the concept of voting for the lesser of two evils, and whether or not that's even a valid type of category. So how do you think about that issue?
Yeah, I think the burden of leadership, the burden of decision-making, the burden of participating in government, which is what we're doing when we vote. When we vote, we are exercising leadership. We are exercising governing authority. We are undertaking its burdens. The burden of leadership and authority is that you are implicated in things that you may not necessarily want to be implicated in. You know, you've all seen the movie where the president has to, order the strike to the Libyan, embassy or something, and he knows he's going to kill several people, but he's got to do it for this greater good or whatever. He's got to make decisions that he knows implicate him in very difficult things. Well, the same is in voting. Let me put it this way. When you vote for a candidate, I think you necessarily endorse everything that candidate says he or she is going to pursue and endorse. Suppose you have candidate, let's go back to Joe. Joe's now running for the Senate and left your church. He's maybe to leave your church, but now Joe's running for the Senate. And Joe says, I support issues A, B, C, D, and E. Meanwhile, Jane says, well, I support issues L, M, N, O, P. And you kind of look at A, B, C, D, and E, and you're like, no, I support 4 of those. I really don't want to support E. But I really like A, B, C, and D, and I certainly don't like Jane's L, M, N, O, P at all. So even though E is morally noxious to me, I know in my heart I don't support that, but I do support A, B, C, D. Therefore, I'm going to pull the lever for Joe. Here's the rough news. The fact that in your heart you don't like issue E doesn't morally absolve you from it. Because when you pull that lever, when you check that box, when you submit that vote, it doesn't distinguish the motives of your heart. It doesn't distinguish that you're supporting A, B, C, D and not E. You are simply pulling a lever, Xing a box for Joe. And Joe's saying, I support A, B, C, D, and E. Right? So you become morally culpable for who you vote for. Now that's a tough thing because we live in a democracy and you know that you're never going to get a candidate who supports everything you do. Fine, that may be the case, but I'm still saying, let's be honest about it. You are still bearing a certain level of moral culpability with the leadership, with the exercise of authority that you're doing in that vote. You can't just wish it away and say, well, but in my heart, I don't really like that. No, you're still responsible. There's still a chain of connection and causation back to your vote.
How does that fit with something that you write in your book, you and your co-author, Andy Naselli? You write, people today often treat their votes as personal expressions of who they are, yet we would encourage you to view votes less as matters of self-expression or tribal identification and more as strategic calculations concerning these kinds of non-biblical matters. When I first read that, I took that more as there's a recognition in every vote that we're kind of doing the best that we can do with the options available to us. and therefore we might not necessarily need to be culpable for all the bad results that might come if those were not intended, to begin with.
Yeah, I think I'm saying the same thing I said there in the booklet. So I'm looking at A, B, C, D, and E, and on the other side, I'm looking at L, M, N, O, P, and I realize neither of them is a perfect choice, and I'm going to exercise my freedom to make a strategic judgment about which of those two is best. What Andy and I are speaking against when we're saying it's not a matter of self-expression, tribal identification. I think the problem with so much voting these days is I have a certain friend group, I have a certain tribe, I have a certain group that I consider myself a part of, and I'm going to vote for them so as to show to everybody else in my group, or even to convince myself I belong to that group, not that group, right? Those are the Fox News watchers. Those are the CNBC watchers or MSNBC. I'm not part of them. My people vote this way. And I'm saying, no. Or Andy and I are saying, no. That's not why you vote as you do. What you do is you look at A, B, C, D, and E. You look at L, M, N, O, P. You say, somebody bring me a sword. Let's cut the baby in half. In other words, we ask God for wisdom, and then we make the best vote strategically, prudentially we can, recognizing that moral culpability goes along with that vote.
So in response to that line of argumentation, there might be a Christian listening who is thinking, well, then I'm just not going to vote because I don't want to be morally culpable for the wrong thing that this candidate might do, even though most of what they do I support. What do you think of that kind of position?
It's a logical and viable position. It's not necessarily the only moral position. One could say that it is the argument against it would be that it is a abdication of the stewardship God has given you, right? Now you might be looking at you and saying, hey, that's a bear. That's a shark. I don't really want to get eaten by either. But man, my kids are on the beach behind me, and I got to pick one or the other. It's a stupid analogy. I could probably go better now.
Kind of breaks down.
I guess the shark wouldn't get onto the beach, but you know what I'm saying. I still have a responsibility to pick what I think is best, what is wisest, even if it means bearing some culpability that I don't really want to bear, and doing otherwise is just to abdicate and forsake the stewardship. Now, your conscience might say, and here we are in Romans 14, right? With weaker and stronger consciences, your conscience might say, no, you can't do that. You have to vote third party. Another person says, no, I gotta pick this or that according to what I think is likely going to win. So I'm not going to bind your conscience on that third party issue question.
Elaborate a little bit on that word culpability versus words that we might be more familiar with in a theological sense of sin or guilt because of something. I think, are you saying essentially that, by voting and then being culpable for the decisions that whoever you voted for might make, good and bad, are we then sitting in that way as well? And if so, again, how can anyone vote if by definition it means we're also participating in some way in sin?
By culpable, yes, I mean morally responsible. And yes, I think there's a question of sin on the line. Unless you want to remove all questions of righteousness and judgment from our votes, unless you want to say that our votes are entirely morally relative and not matters of sin and righteousness, they're just not moral activities. Our participation in the U.S. government through the vote is not a moral activity at all. It's morally neutral. Unless you want to say that, and I don't think most people do, well then, yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that sin is potentially on the line. Now, different Christians are going to judge differently about whether this or that is more sinful, but you just can't get away from it. Now, good news. God is wise. God recognizes the stakes. And we live inside the gospel. I don't think you need to live in total fear. Nonetheless, if you've been to seminary ethics class, kind of first day of class sort of ethics question, you're standing at the door and the Nazis, you're standing, you answer the door, it knocks, Nazis show up and say, are you hiding Jews in the basement? And you are hiding Jews in the basement. Do you say, no, I'm not hiding Jews in the basement and lie? Or do you say, I have to tell the truth. Yes, there are Jews in my basement, and let them be taken away and murdered? Well, gosh, I mean, there's just not a clean answer to that one. And I could pretend like the exercise of a voting is always morally clean. I don't think that's accurate. I think it involves tough ethical decisions that in which matters of sin and righteousness are at stake.
Yeah.
Praise God, I don't have his scale of judgment, and I'm not going to get on this podcast or any other podcast and tell you exactly what the scale of God's judgment is on these various kinds of matters. Nonetheless, we are preparing for that day, and every Christian voter out there needs to be prepare themselves for that day as they go to the ballot box on Tuesday in November.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for helping us think through these important issues at a time when it really is important for Christians to be intentional about these things and to know how to act Christianly in our politics. We appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, thank you, brother. I enjoyed the conversation.
That was Jonathan Leeman on navigating political disagreements as Christians. For more, be sure to check out the book he co-authored with Andy Naselli with Crossway, How Can I Love Church Members with Different Politics? Available online or at your local Christian bookstore. For more interviews like this, subscribe to the Crossway Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast player. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review, which helps us spread the word about the show. Crossway is a not-for-profit Christian ministry that exists solely for the purpose of proclaiming the truth of God's Word through publishing gospel-centered content. Visit us today at crossway.org.